Hello, everybody. I'm Paul Hansbury. I'm Research Fellow with the Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub at the University of Warwick. I'm pleased to welcome you today to our webinar, where we'll be looking at the question, what does Donald Trump's election as US President mean for Eastern Europe's security? This event has been organised together with the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, and my colleague in Stockholm, Victoria Lefkavets, is going to say something now briefly about the project that we are working on together. Victoria?
Thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar. My name is Victoria Lefkavets. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies, where I lead a project focusing on Belarus. If I may, a few words about our center. It was established about 4 years ago. We are funded by the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and our main work focuses on research and policy analysis of developments in Russia and Eastern Europe. We cooperate with a great deal of international partners, and I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the University of Warwick, in particular to Professor Elena Korostelova and to Dr. Paul Hansbury for a very fruitful collaboration on the project named European-Belarus Forum. The main mission of this forum, of this initiative, is to create a joint platform for communication and common action on Belarus. We are very much looking forward to extending our cooperation in the future. Additionally, and most importantly, I would also like to thank NATO Public Diplomacy Division for providing to us vital financial support, which has been crucial for implementing this project. And now, very quickly to the topic of today's discussion. So we decided to choose the topic focusing on the implication of elections in US for Eastern European security, with a particular emphasis on Belarus. And as many of us will agree, I'm sure, Belarus is currently going through a very crucial phase in its development, and its significance for European security, for regional security, has never been greater than now. And therefore, Western policymakers should ascribe higher priority to Belarus and keep it high on the agenda. Our time is very short today. We're limited of time, and we are very much looking forward to insights and perspectives of our distinguished panelists. And therefore, without further delay, I would like to pass the floor back to Paul, who will moderate our discussion today. Thank you all very much for joining us, and I'm very much looking forward to an engaging conversation. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Victoria. So as mentioned, our theme today is security in Eastern Europe as Trump returns to the presidency. I do need to say that this event is being recorded and it will be available online afterwards. So we're going to go straight to our first speaker today, Dr. Petr Lunak, who is going to give us a broad overview of the security relationship between America and Europe. Dr. Lunak holds degrees from Charles University in Prague and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced Studies in Washington, D.C. He joined the Czech Foreign Service in 1988, and since 2001, he has been a member of the International Secretariat of NATO based in Brussels, where he is currently deputy section head in the Public Diplomacy Division. He has written both scholarly books and he informs me a couple of novels as well. I should say that Petr will not be available to stay at the event for questions, but he is extremely well versed in the history of NATO, and it'd be great to hear what the security situation is today in its historical context. Over to you, Petr.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. very much for your kind words of introduction. As you said already, I will be giving a sort of broad outline of where actually the European security and NATO in particular are at this moment. So at the beginning of the Trump administration. The topic of this panel is fascinating, but it's sort of difficult for me as an international civil servant to speculate. So I will, try to summarize more than where we are than necessarily what the implications of the changeover in the US and elsewhere is. Let me say by saying, well, 2024 is actually especially in many ways because it's been 75 years since NATO was founded in 1949. It's been 25 years since the first Cold War enlargement in 1999, 20 years since the second post-Cold War enlargement. It's been 30 years since NATO actually launched its partnership programs for countries, outside of NATO. But it's also a third year of Russia's war against Ukraine. And I would like to say, just to make a few points about where all this, the last decade, which I think, really made the world a very different place compared to when it was before, and what it means for the future. Look, Putin has brought a brutal war back to Europe. Global competition has accelerated, and many other challenges from terrorism to disruptive technologies, from cyber attacks to climate change, have transformed the security landscape and, frankly, our everyday lives. The world has changed, and so has NATO. That has always been the case, that when there is a new security situation, NATO needs to change as well. Frankly, I think, as a historian, the past decade has undoubtedly been the most transformational one for the alliance since the end of the Cold War. But I would even say, since 1949, perhaps 1960 was also the 1960s was also transformational in many ways. But this past decade has been transformational in many in really dramatic way. How have we reacted as NATO? We have strengthened our defenses by putting tens of thousands of combat-ready NATO soldiers on our eastern flank. In fact, for the first time in our history, we now have 500,000 troops on high readiness across the alliance. Those troops are backed by substantial naval and air power. We are ramping up production of military capabilities, and we are building closer ties between our defense industries across Europe and North America. Allies have also significantly increased their investment in defense. The number of allies spending at least 2% of GDP on defense has gone from 3 in 2014 to 23 in 2024. We do all this not to provoke war, but to prevent war and preserve peace. This is NATO's core mission. NATO, in fact, has become not only stronger, but also broader, also bigger, larger. 4 countries actually have joined NATO since 2014 in the past decade: Montenegro, North Macedonia, Finland, and Sweden. And in fact, Finland and Sweden joined precisely in response to Russia's attack against Ukraine. Ukraine is closer than ever to NATO, where it rightfully belongs. We have also deepened our partnerships with countries in the Indo-Pacific region. We've expanded our partnerships in our southern neighborhoods and brought our cooperation with the European Union to unprecedented levels. So I think there are. In view of all of this, I think still there are 4 or 5 lessons to be actually drawn from the past decade. The first one is the realization that you cannot have security on the cheap. Security does not come for free. You have to be willing to pay the price for peace. After the Cold War, when the tensions went down, so did our defense spending. And it was only in 2014 that NATO allies, agreed that within a decade, that is by 2024, they would have to ramp up defense spending to at least 2% of GDP. And indeed, from 3 in 2014, now 23 allies spend 2%. That is the good news. The bad news is that actually NATO has 32 members, so not everyone honors that the defense investment pledge. We still have countries to do better, or NATO allies who need to do better. And the second bad news is that the 2% benchmark is no longer enough, frankly, and that's something I would expect probably from the Trump administration to raise whether 2%, which is not, by the way, the ceiling, but the floor is enough. So I'm sort of expecting a debate again about how much is enough. We have improved. We are investing more, but what was fine, what seemingly looked like okay 10 years ago doesn't seem to be fine anymore. Sufficient anymore. The second lesson I would mention is probably that freedom is more valuable than free trade. We have to come to terms to the fact that our economic choices have security consequences and security implications. Until recently, some allies believed that buying gas from Russia was a purely commercial matter. However, they somehow forgot that when having energy contracts or gas contracts with Russia, they're actually concluding on contracts with Putin and the Kremlin. Frankly, we must not make the same mistake with China. We need to better protect our critical infrastructure, avoid exporting technologies that can be used against us, and reduce our dependence on critical materials from strategic competitors, including China. And China, actually, who the strategic concept, NATO strategic concept from 2022, sees as a challenge or its policies, its coercive policies, a challenge to NATO's security, is also seen now by NATO as the decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine by providing, by supplying all sorts of technologies and so on and so forth. So that's really the second lesson, that freedom is more valuable than free trade. The third lesson is that military strength is a prerequisite for dialogue. This is clearly demonstrated in Ukraine. We don't believe that we can change Mr. Putin's, intention as far as by providing support and weapons to Ukraine, that we can change Mr. Putin's, intentions as far as Ukraine is concerned. He made it very clear what he thinks of Ukraine sovereignty. He doesn't even, he said at some point that he doesn't believe that Ukraine is even a nation. But we believe that by supporting Ukraine, we can actually change his strategic calculus. And in this respect, I think it's important to emphasize at this point that that where Ukraine pushed to sign a peace deal on terms that are favorable to Moscow, that would actually be not only bad for Ukraine, but it would be bad for all allies, including the US. Because the risks from Russia and North Korea, in fact, are linked and concern directly U.S. security. Russia is supplying missile technology to North Korea and cash to Iran, And this missile technology in North Korean hands can actually be a direct challenge to or a direct threat to U.S. security. So I think we have to make sure that Ukraine has what she needs. Frankly, Putin, as we believe, is not interested in peace. What we need to make sure that whatever the future, that Ukraine, if there are peace negotiations, for example, that Ukraine can approach them from the position of strength. This was my third lesson, and now.
You okay?
I cannot. I lost you now. I cannot hear you. Oh no! Now it's fine. Now it's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Apologies. There seems to have been a little technological challenge. And the fourth lesson, I think, is that we have to recognize that military power has its limits, and this is something that we learned and found out from our experience in Afghanistan, frankly, where we tried after the in addition to making sure that Afghanistan is no longer the hub of international terrorism, we tried, or we took upon ourselves to build to basically build a nation in Afghanistan. It clearly was above our above our capabilities. So I think we need to make sure that we do not overstretch ourselves, and don't accept tasks that are clearly beyond what we can achieve. My final point would be, and that goes back to the transatlantic bond, is really that we should not be taking the transatlantic bond for granted. This is something, we have leaders. We are increasingly having leaders in our nations who do not have the experience of. They have the experience with the Cold War. It's very marginal. We have hardly any leader who remembers why NATO was founded in late 1940s. And then and we have to make sure that we actually, our leaders, understand the value of NATO and should not take the security bond between North America and Europe for granted. In fact, it would be a major mistake if the US went alone, or somehow decided to go it alone, because even a country as militarily powerful needs allies. And of course, it would be hazardous, I think, for Europeans to actually to go it alone as well, for whatever reason. Let's not forget that 80% of all defense spending in the alliance actually comes from that are outside of the European Union. So I think this is really something that we need to make sure for the future, in the interests of our common security, in the interests of peace and stability in Europe and also beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Petr, very much. I think those 5 lessons were formulated very well, and they made for very good discussion points. So certainly we may pick them up when we come to Q&A, though we appreciate that you need to dash to your meeting. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your attention. Absolutely. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Dr. Tatsiana Kulakevich. Dr. Kulakevich is Associate Professor of Instruction at the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and Research Fellow and Affiliate Faculty at the Institute for Russian, Eurasian and European Studies at the University of South Florida. She has published widely both in peer-reviewed journals and also in the international media, including writing for the Washington Post and the US News. Her most recent academic paper is in the Nationalities Papers, where she gives an explanation for Vladimir Putin's calculations prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. She's also written recently on Trump's election. Although it wasn't unforeseeable, his election, it's nonetheless a turn that many in Europe find hard to understand, I think. No one is under any illusions that Trump sees Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war differently from the Biden administration. And I think the prevalent mood in Europe is one of gloom. But Tatsiana, perhaps you see some reasons to challenge this gloom that has settled upon Europe. I know that you have some slides to share with us. I'll ask you to keep your initial remarks to 10 minutes, please. And allow me quickly to remind our audience that questions can be put into the Q&A box in Zoom as we go along. Okay, Tatsiana, you have the floor, please.
Yes, hello everybody, welcome and thank you everyone for joining. My slides are just 7 slides, so it's very short. So I'm gonna begin with basically going to the just very recent news from the General Kellogg saying that in response to Russian oligarch Malafeyev kind of refusing to listen to the United States, he said that you need to understand the United States to not to listen. So let's kind of talk about the United States to understand what's going on and how it behaves, to see how what we might be expecting in Eastern Europe. So basically, the thing is that let's look at Donald Trump. So Trump is no different than any other U.S. president, if you see my slides. So, and I'm saying that not just any other U.S. president, if you think that I'm talking about Obama or Biden, I'm talking about more than that. Bill Clinton, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Washington, every president of the United States saw the United States as special and exceptional. And now we hear the US exceptionalism, and that's not a new thing, actually, even if it might seem that way. It has been there forever. It's just highlighted at the moment because the elections just happened. So essentially, the United States seeks to shape the world to serve its own interests. So it's very interests oriented. So what are the US interests, you will ask? So 2 slides on that. So one thing is the following: the US and Europe remain each other's most important markets. Not the US and China, but US and European Union, actually. Various items, you can Google it, I'm not making it up, it's not just guess, it's services and all kinds of stuff. And as soon as United States is interested in the global trade and it benefiting US interests, it will be motivated to maintain a role in European security because instability is kind of $0, right? So we are talking dollars here. And that means that NATO is gonna be there, and it's not in the United States interest to get rid of NATO. And to kind of to add to this point, last year in 2023, in December, United States adopted the law that the president cannot unilaterally withdraw from NATO. So essentially, if there is a perception that Trump will leave NATO, that's not true. He is not capable to do that according to the law unilaterally. So another thing is that our previous speaker already started talking about China, and we need to remember that China and the United States are in United States sees China as its main enemy. And there is nothing to suggest that Donald Trump's presidency will deviate from the previous perceptions of China as being the main enemy of the United States. And again, it doesn't matter, Democrats or Republicans. We're talking about the United States as a country as a whole. Obama and Biden and Trump 1, 2 all looked at China as the main enemy. So, and that's not going to change. And if you start thinking about that logically, if United States makes Russia happy, that makes China happy. So that's not in the United States' interests. And going to another point, that it has been widely portrayed that Donald Trump will listen to Vladimir Putin. They like each other. They are kind of buddies, and he will do everything for his friend Vladimir Putin. That's not true. Donald Trump already how it's called kind of had exchanged love letters with the Kim Jong-un during his previous presidency, and when he realized that this love relationship does not benefit the United States, this stopped. So just kind of throwing you a few kind of throwing, that's not what I mean, kind of showing you a few points what Donald Trump did during his previous presidency regarding kind of what did not benefit Russia. For example, he approved the sale of anti-tank missiles to Ukraine, which Obama did not. He withdrew the US from intermediate range nuclear forces treaty with Russia. It was not beneficial. Russia reacted to that and said that it's not a good idea, and that's still happened. And he signed the Protecting Europe's Energy Security Act. What does that mean? It means sanctions on the Nord Stream 2, which the sanctions were removed by the Biden administration, and then they were imposed again when the full-scale invasion began. So essentially, this shows that the United States' interests are primary concern of the United States, not any friendship here, even that if that might seem that way. So what about Belarus, which is where I was born, and I grew up there, and it's important to draw attention, and I'm grateful that you guys are drawing attention to Belarus these days. So what about it? It's kind of, the question is there a certain point at which Lukashenko's coercive capabilities and Russian support might lose their effectiveness? Well, this depends. Belarus is not a key player, unfortunately, on the global arena. It depends on what's going to happen with the Russian government. The job of Belarusian diaspora is to draw attention to the problems of Belarus, not to lose it from the media and from attention, from the spotlight. It should be highlighted. And the last slide here is this. Any pressure, what about Ukraine? Because the future of Belarus depends a lot on what's going to happen in Ukraine, because we will see if the government in Russia will be maybe somewhat weakened or not, what's going to happen there. So any pressure Trump places on Zelensky to end the war would likely aim at a compromise, if that's a compromise, that does not weaken Ukraine. Why? Because it's not in the United States' interest, because they are aligned against, they should be aligned against gains by Russia and China. So this kind of, I'm looking at this from a more an optimistic perspective, even, and at the same time, I should kind of highlight as well that yes, Donald Trump's presidency is still unpredictable in details, and we should not speculate, but based on facts, we can see the game on the global scale that the United States will look at this interest, and it's in the United States' interest not to give away Europe or Ukraine. And as a result, hopefully, Belarus will benefit if the window of opportunity opens on the arena. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you, Tatsiana. It's good to have a little bit of optimism, and so I'm grateful for that. It's also bringing Belarus in your concluding remarks there segues neatly into our third speaker today, who will be Franak Viachorka, who is Chief of Staff to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, the leader of Belarus's democratic movement. He is also Vice President of the Digital Communications as Chief of Staff to Sviatlana, to Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya. He organises the work of her office and her international and diplomatic engagement, in which role he has accompanied her to meetings with world leaders. Franak, perhaps you could pick up somewhere where Tatsiana left off, and perhaps also tell us how the Belarusian democracy movement views Mr. Trump's return to the presidency. Do you see any positives in Mr. Trump back in the White House?
Thank you, Paul. And Tatsiana made fantastic remarks and description of the situation. So the truth is that no one really knows what to expect and what will happen after January 20. We can guess, we can speculate, but we can see what are first appointees of Trump, and they are not those who will be appeasing dictators and will not be selling Ukraine or democracy, in hands of tyranny. People like Marco Rubio, for example. So we don't share like pessimism and dramatism of some people. We see that there are opportunities, there are difficulties, there are challenges, because many new people will come who don't care or don't know much about Belarus. And it will be our task to share this knowledge, to spread this information, to explain the importance of Belarus, but also of Ukraine, and interconnection between Belarus and Ukraine, because there is no such understanding in the United States that Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, even Georgia, all are interconnected, all are the parts of the same puzzle. And I think this is what we have to do right now as democratic forces of Belarus, to reach out to people who will be in their positions, to build a trustful relationship, the same as we did when the President Biden came to power, because I cannot say that the relationship with Biden's administration were like so strong from the very first days. Yes, we started from 0 point as well. And we got the first meeting called Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya with President Biden only half a year later, and there were some considerations. This meeting couldn't, first was not approved, or also later under media pressure it happened, and then it became better and stronger. And right now we are there. We are in very deep and a good cooperation. Just right now, I'm in the place where we concluded the strategic dialogue with the United States. And here near me, I have representatives of U.S. Embassy and State Department. After this dialogue, we had 8-hour session with basically all departments, all offices of the State Department, and most of them will continue their work on Belarus. They're not political appointees. And I'm sure that they will, those who were working on Belarus, who were working on Ukraine, they will be doing this under Trump's administration. So this project that we launched, like strategic dialogue, the relationship between U.S. government and Belarus Democratic Movement, they will continue. Will it be the highest level, the secretary level, as it was before? Will it be deputy level? It's the question of the priorities of the new administration, but our task will be to make this, to keep Belarus, of course, in the priorities. Speaking about our plans, of course, our biggest fear is that when peace talks or peace agreements between Russia and Ukraine will be taking place, and US will be definitely taking part in that Belarus topic will be omitted, or what could be even worse, Belarus will be left to Putin, will be left as the consolation prize. We closed the Ukraine problem, solved this issue, thanks God the war ended or postponed, and Belarus, let's leave as it is. And in this case, we will anchor Russian presence in Belarus with its military bases, with its troops, with its reported nuclear weapons, and this integration, which looks rather like occupation, creeping occupation, it will be fixed for years ahead. And for us, it will be very, very difficult to change the situation if, the war ends and everyone will switch to other problems of the world. So what we are trying to do right now, to explain to American public, to explain to new administration that the war will not end until Ukraine is free, Belarus is free of Russian influence and of dictatorship, and this is in the interest of the United States. When we speak about America First concept, many think that it's about isolationism, but America First, it's about American leadership. And if new administration wants to have America First, they need to increase the presence in Europe and influence in Europe. And where it can be done better, that by securing freedom and democracy in Belarus, Ukraine, but also Moldova. That will be it could be the big victory for new administration. And actually Belarus, in general, it's much easier to change small, compact, homogeneous Belarus compared to big, huge imperialistic Russia, which never had democratic tradition, compared in contrast to Belarus, which was always part of the European civilization, Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth, Grand Duchy of Lithuania, etc., etc. So we are trying to explain that let's not think that first we change Russia, which can be very difficult, problem for $1 million. But let's try to change Belarus, and through changes in Belarus influence changes in Russia, as we saw in 2020, when protests in Belarus sparked. Next weeks and months, protests in Khabarovsk, in other cities, and even Russian people were bringing Belarusian flags in their protests as the flags of changes, as the flag of different Russia. And the new Russian flag, Russian opposition is using right now, it's white, blue, white. It's basically copied from Belarusian national, white, red, white flag, which is also like interesting, this interference of the situation. So we also hope that American leadership will be about unifying, but not dividing alliances. During the last 5 years, Biden's administration managed to build the unity between EU, UK, Canada, also Switzerland, Norway, and Ukraine. And most of the sanctions and policy points were taken together. Even if we take EU Council conclusions and decisions by White House or Congress, they're very, very much aligned. And I think, in Trump's interest to have this alignment. But of course, we can expect more American interest in these alignments. We can expect more expectations. We can expect more demands on budget spendings for NATO. Yes, that's possible. But for us Belarusians, it's not so bad. For us Belarusians, it's good if there will be aligned strong position, strong anti-Russian stance of the democratic world. If there will be topic of confronting tyrannies, Iran, China, and we will try to add Belarus on Lukashenko's regime, not Belarus, on that list. That could be also helpful. And the last point, if I may, what we are trying to do right now, to explain interconnection and general connection between Belarus, Iran, and China. Because often Belarus is seen only as the proxy of Russia, as a puppet of Russia, and Lukashenko as the collaborator. But also China and Iran has interest in Belarus too, because of its geographical and geopolitical position. And China, right now they postponed the building of $10 billion terminal in Belarus because they saw Belarus as this transit trade hub on its way to Europe. Belarus was seen as the experimental base for telecoms expansion to Europe. And for example, there are contracts which includes the necessity to include Huawei technology in all smart homes built in Belarus, for example, just as example. So, and Iran as well, which is using Belarus, for primarily trade in the weapons trade and arms trade. So if we try to add this aspect also to American policy towards Belarus, that would be much helpful, for Americans, to explain why Belarus should be also on the priority list of new administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Franak. And I think one thing that comes out there is a strong reminder that relationships are always two ways. Both Belarusians and the new US administration have some influence over each other, and likewise Belarus and Russia, the incumbent regime in Belarus, in Russia, or Belarusians and Russians, perhaps I should say, have influence can work both ways. It shouldn't be looked at from one side only. Let me remind our audience that you can put questions in the Q&A on Zoom, please, and they will be asked of the speakers in due course. Our final speaker today is Nigel Gould-Davies. Dr. Gould-Davies is a senior fellow in the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He served in the British Foreign Office, including as head of the economic section in Moscow, and later as Britain's ambassador to Belarus in 2008, 2009. He has also held academic posts both in the UK and in Thailand, and he is the author of a book, Tectonic Politics, Global Political Risk in an Age of Transformation, and he publishes often in the IISS House Journal Survival. So we've had some quite contrasting views, Nigel, from the previous speakers. What does Trump's return mean for Western consensus on Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus? You have 10 minutes, please.
Yeah. So one of the advantages of going last is that you can spark off some of the comments that the other speakers have made, and I've listened with great interest to what's been said already. I would say, firstly, there's a very wide, unusually wide range of uncertainty, unpredictability in the future course of a Trump foreign policy, including and in particular towards Europe. And rather than making predictions, it's helpful to structure the problem by trying to set out some of the sources of our understanding about what might happen and some of the factors that might shape the evolution of a Trump foreign policy. Lurking in the background is a new fear that the transatlantic alliance has not really had to face in this form ever since it emerged in the late 1940s, which is to say some form of decoupling of the alliance at American initiative. There was plenty of concern in the course of the Cold War that there might be a decoupling, which is to say some critical degree of estrangement between Western Europe and the United States. But the fear was more that it would come from the European side, that as Soviet influence gradually extended informally and in political rather than military means over, say, West Germany or Italy, you might have some process of creeping Finlandization, as it was called. The Finns, of course, hate that term, and perhaps for good reason. But the concern was that Western Europe would be persuaded in some loose way to accommodate itself to Soviet interests. It was much less common to worry that it was the United States that would abandon its commitments to Europe. But we are now, for the first time, in a strong form, faced with that. So the implication of that is that the critical question that faces Europe is to make the case to the Trump administration that Europe's security and prosperity are necessary preconditions for America's own, which is to say there's a fundamental and enduring alignment of deep interests that will justify a continued American commitment of attention and resources to Europe. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that if we have time. So three sources of insights that we can try to look at to explore this problem of what Trump might do towards Europe, towards Eastern Europe, towards Ukraine, and towards Belarus. And the first is what happened in Trump's first term. The second is what we know about Trump's intrinsic sort of reflexes and instincts about foreign policy generally. And the third is what are the circumstances, both domestic and international, in which Trump will take office again in this coming January. So on the first is very briefly, I much appreciate some of Tatsiana's analysis here. I think it's very sound. And she presents a picture that's more kind of complex and modulated than the assumption that that Trump will, in some sense, seek to distance himself to weaken his commitment in Europe, although that is a real concern, as I mentioned a moment ago. And Tatsiana makes these good points about Trump doing at least some things that Putin will not have welcomed. on the other side of the balance of scales, as it were, we have, the worrying signs of various forms of cooperation between those around Trump and those around Putin in the Kremlin. And we have the notorious summit meeting between the two leaders in Helsinki and much else to worry about. But there are these mitigating factors. I will add to those the fact that the Trump administration refused to do something that Putin wanted very much, but could not persuade Trump to do, which is to say the extension of the New START treaty, the last bit of strategic arms control. The Kremlin was virtually begging Trump to extend that for a further 5 years, and it took the first days of the Biden administration to do that bidding. Just as, and Tatsiana has already made this point, it was Trump who sanctioned Nord Stream 2, and the Biden administration that lifted those sanctions. It's worth bearing in mind, though, on the other hand, that there were plenty of adults in the room to constrain some of the more worrying instincts of Trump, both in the White House and also in Congress as well. So yes, indeed, Congress, as Tatsiana again noted, passed a piece of legislation that prevents a president from withdrawing from NATO. They also passed, with a very large bipartisan majority, the big omnibus sanctions bill, the Katza bill, in 2017, which Trump is known to have disliked, but was passed with a veto-proof majority. So the worry sort of the next time around is that, yes, even if Putin can't withdraw from NATO, he might scale back his resource commitments to it, and that Article 5, in only a very weak form, may continue to apply. And many of the very significant sanctions imposed by executive order and not by legislation under the Biden administration could be easily reversed. Not to say that will happen, but that's a worry. I worry this time that we have a different composition in Congress and different people who are being appointed to cabinet positions. So those constraints, to the extent they are effective the first time round, may not be so now. We know that in terms of Trump's sort of instincts and reflexes, that it really will be all about America's interests and America first, security and prosperity, and that values and ideals will play little or no role. And here I differ, I think, just slightly in my interpretation of where Trump fits into the recent history of presidents. Presidents have always talked about, as Tatsiana said, in a sense, some America's special mission to the world, some sense of larger responsibility. Now, one might say that sometimes that's been, cynically constructed to justify America's interests, but rhetorically, and more than rhetorically, the value, some form of values agenda for higher ideals than interests alone has always been an important part of America's official thinking. And I don't see that really at all in Trump's thinking, be all about interest. So again, come back to this point. What I presented as a question and challenge for all of us. What would a European offer to America now look like? We know there's not going to be any great appeal of values to the White House come January. We know that Trump's preference is to work bilaterally to strike deals rather than relationships, and to do things transactionally rather than through larger institutions. So how does Europe make the case for a purely selfish, narrow, self-interested American case for commitment to Europe, including Eastern Europe? I have some thoughts about that, about interest in others. Thirdly, and I'll finish on this, what about the circumstances in which Trump will return to office, and how are they importantly different from those that dominated Trump's first term? Well, firstly, foreign policy issues are much more important, a much more salient part of his agenda now. Foreign policy, of course, was there in his first administration, but they really didn't, for the most part, intrude in any systematically significant way. And yet we have the war in the Middle East, we have the war in Ukraine, of course, and heightened concerns across the American foreign policy establishment about China. So this will be much more an administration that is seeking to engage actively with a series of urgent foreign policy issues. And as we know, Trump has said, a typical piece of Trump hyperbole, I would say, that on day one he would solve the Russia-Ukraine war. It's impossible to imagine him doing that, but we have seen, in particular from his incoming Vice President J.D. Vance, elements of what that might look like. One worry I have is that such views share a misconception, which I think is quite widely shared elsewhere, that the problem of ending the war, or at least ending the fighting, should be defined mainly in terms of persuading Ukraine to compromise and persuading Ukraine to give up territory in return for peace. That's only one half of the equation for ending the fighting, of course. The other half, which I'd say is the more difficult half, is that Putin has to be persuaded that it better serves his interests to stop fighting than to continue fighting. And I, at this point, have seen no evidence that Trump and those around him understand that it will be much harder than they imagine to persuade Putin to agree to halt his fighting. And I believe that unless very significant threats of costs are imposed, made to Putin, I think it's very likely he will more or less ignore any proposal. His initial primary objectives of the invasion remain unchanged, which is to say the political and military domination of all or almost all of Ukraine, and certainly including Kiev, and he feels he's slowly gaining the upper hand. What would it take him, what would it take to persuade or compel him to stop fighting? I think that's the urgent question. Finally, and I really will stop on this, it's worth bearing in mind that for Trump, almost everything important is ultimately personal. So it's not even about America's interests as such, it's about his own personal interests and priorities. And an intriguing detail that I think is worth at least keeping in our minds, a high priority of Trump will be thinking about legacy. He wasn't thinking about legacy in his first term because he hoped to get a second term. Now, even Trump can't change the American Constitution. So this really will be his final term. He's thinking about legacy as he gets older as well. He really wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And he wants that. So that's a driver of his behavior. So again, I leave it as a question for discussion. What would it take, in particular, what would he have to do in terms of, again, I repeat it, threats and warnings and constraints on Putin to bring about an end to the war that might conceivably, as he would see it, bring him a Nobel Prize? Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. That is a question for us to ponder, and perhaps when we come to the questions, and I already have a few questions, Tatsiana and Franak may want to comment on that specific point. I have a question. In fact, I have several questions. I will ask one question to each of you. I'll ask the questions together and then we'll go around in the same order. So the question I have for Tatsiana, so this actually speaks to something that Franak did pick up on in his remarks. The question was asked before Franak spoke. Given the rather close economic and political connection between Belarus and China, for example, the Great Stone Economic Park in Belarus, how likely is it that Trump's administration policy indirectly puts pressure on Lukashenko's regime through its pressure on China? And we know there's a lot of China hawks among Trump's intended appointments to cabinet. So that's the question, how the US-China relationship might affect policy on Belarus, may affect Belarus. There's a question for Franak, which is a question about prospective pragmatism of Mr. Trump. How likely do you think it is that Trump will engage in talks with Mr. Lukashenko rather than the democratic forces? And will he be on the same page? Or where do you think Trump is on the page of recognizing the legitimacy or non-legitimacy of Lukashenko and the democratic and Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, respectively? So that's a question. There's two questions actually in there. One about engagement of the Trump administration with Lukashenko, and one about how he will view the legitimacy of the regime and the democratic movement. And of course, Trump's inauguration will be on the 20th of January, and on the 26th of January, we can more or less assume that Mr. Lukashenko will be claiming a new term. And question for Nigel, can one potentially treat the lack of strong values as a benefit rather than an issue? Could it be easier to persuade Trump on certain foreign policy decisions by presenting them as beneficial to him than it was in respect of the Biden administration? Is there a way we can leverage Trump's lack of values, who we is, I suppose that means Europeans. And also, as an extra question for you, you mentioned about constraints, congressional constraints on Trump during the first term, his previous term. And I think although the Republicans had control of both chambers in 2017 when Trump took office, it was the case that there were a lot of people in the Republican Party that were still opposed to him, which doesn't seem to be quite as obvious looking at the situation today. So I wondered if there are other constraints outside of Congress in the Republican Party membership and in public opinion, and if you had any thoughts on how those might constrain some of Trump's foreign policy. And in fact, that question could probably be asked of all three of you. But so if we go to Tatsiana first, the question about China and Trump's policy on China and how that might affect Belarus, please.
Well, China, yes, we should just, mention that, yes, China and Belarus are trading. It's Belarusian second major trading partner, and it's not new. So China and Belarus have been in a relationship for some time. So if we look at the United States, yes, China is a main enemy, and as soon as it does not see Belarus as a main player on the global stage, Belarus will keep trading with China because it's beneficial for Lukashenko to have an alternative from Putin in China as a partner. So that's kind of beneficial. And I would say like this question is also kind of throwing at Franak here, because the relationship between the United States and Belarus, it depends also on the work of the Belarusian democratic forces, because people here have pressure can apply pressure on the American government. Because if you remember, Belarus Democracy Act, which has a lot of different sanctions inside, has been initiated by the Belarusian diaspora in the United States, and that's why it was kind of not the only reason, but but under big pressure of the Belarusian democratic forces, the sanctions have been happening. So it's a joint work, bringing attention to Belarus and showing that, Belarus is important, not just, as Franak mentioned, Iran, like, China, Iran, and everything else, not just China, but also Iran. And that's kind of highlighting Belarus and applying pressure on the Belarusian government. So that's what I would say, because that's how China is an enemy. So that's a good opportunity to use this rhetoric to highlight Belarus.
Okay, thank you. And Franak, do you want to both respond to that and pick up the question? I've forgotten what it was.
There were several. Yeah, I remember. Yeah. So I don't think we will feel change immediately after January 20. First of all, because Belarus does not exist on the map of President Trump. And I don't think it existed before. And I don't see anything that Lukashenko can offer Trump. Putin can. Lukashenko doesn't. Lukashenko is toxic. He doesn't give any political points. He's not so important in trade. In the first period of Trump's presidency, 4 years ago, like from 2016 to 20, there was attempts to engage with Lukashenko. And back then, they saw it as the opportunity to split Lukashenko and Putin. First, oil tankers came from the United States to Belarus. Secretary Pompeo came to Minsk. But later, Secretary Pompeo described in his memoirs this visit to Minsk. And he were coming with the big expectations and hopes, and he hoped that he will manage, to explain Lukashenko or educate him. But he said that I spent like hours in one cabinet with him, and for 4 hours, Lukashenko was talking different conspiracies to me, and he realized that Lukashenko is totally crazy. And I think, right now, people who dealt with Lukashenko before, almost everyone already realized that it's impossible to make deals with Lukashenko. He will betray, he will refuse, and in the end, Lukashenko will misuse your trust. And most of the foreign leaders, they already have this knowledge, and I think people who will come with Trump, they also have or had or probably, assume that this would happen if they will try to engage with Lukashenko again. So I don't see much big chance of this happening. But probably there will be voices, trying to play this game again. And this would be our task, to explain why this game is senseless and useless. Lukashenko is in much worse condition than it was 8 years ago. Physical, political condition, economical condition. And it's much more difficult, almost impossible to divide, to separate him from Putin there, like a Siam, twin brothers. Speaking about engagement with democratic forces, I think, our primary point for engagement will be not the White House, but State Department. And the people, who work in Belarus, they will remain the same in place. Probably new people will come, probably Marco Rubio, if he will be confirmed, will come with new team. And here we will have to work with them and to establish trust and to explain, the American interest in Belarus changes. And nobody knows what will be the reaction. Nobody knows what will be their position and what will be the position of White House. But I assume it will be similar to what President Biden's administration was doing before. Plus, Belarus is how we are dependent right now on U.S. Primarily, it's assistance, U.S. assistance to Belarus, but financial here ends only in the end of 2025. So for 2025, assistance will remain as it was defined by Biden's administration. So also it will not change. Sanctions will not be lifted because they were renewed just recently, and until end of next year they will continue. And I don't think anyone will be like stopping them in the mid of the year. Any additional visits of Lukashenko to Washington or Trump to Minsk almost impossible. So we don't see it. The only engagement that could be possible potentially is if peace talks happen and if it's like physical meeting and Trump's coming and Putin will come. Putin will try to bring Lukashenko, because now Putin always brings and push Lukashenko everywhere. He needs Lukashenko, basically. And if Putin will bring Lukashenko as the member of his delegation, then probably there will be some interaction, but it doesn't mean any meaningful engagement. With Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, I think there will be much more chances for engagement on the international forum. Even, soon at this Notre Dame event, it will not happen because Sviatlana will not come. But at such events there will be always possibility of engagement, same as it was during, as it is during Biden's administration. So I think we will have much more chance, to build relationship that Lukashenko has, but how to make this relationship practical and bring Belarus to democratic transition. This is the question, a big challenge.
Okay, thank you, Franak. I have another question for each of you. Tatsiana, when you were speaking, you said that the US acts in its own interests, which seems agreeable, and you pointed to US economic interests. Trump obviously has been talking a lot about tariffs and whacking 20% tariffs on all imports from Europe, and China and Mexico and Canada even more. Can we realistically expect that will happen? Because it doesn't seem to be in line with US interests to. As you said, trade with Europe is really important to the US economy and national interest. So just how much can we really expect that to happen? Might he change his mind? Nigel, on NATO. So we don't really know what the contours of Trump's mythical 24-hour peace look like. But there was in Reuters this morning published some analysis emphasizing that concessions to territorial concessions seem to be kind of baked into most of the administration's thinking. And there was also that NATO membership would be off the table as far as the incoming administration for Ukraine would be off the table as far as the incoming administration was concerned. That was the suggestion. And I suppose the question is, it feels after nearly 3 years, well, it will be 3 years by the time Trump comes into office. What can Europe do? What can European states do in this situation? What should they be doing in terms of military support for Ukraine and its security arrangements in the future? And Franak, it's a little bit of a curveball in terms of what we've been talking about. But I have a question from the audience about the Belarusian diaspora in the US. And what it can do to advocate for the release of political prisoners in Belarus, and perhaps does the Trump administration, when it comes in, offer any new opportunities here? So, Tatsiana, do you want to? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I am muted. I was kind of trying to give Nigel, he didn't comment for previous time. So basically, I would say this. So it's not just trade; it's investments also. So United States, Europe is the US's biggest investment place. So investments will be going there, and the trade is not gonna disappear. Not for the United States to lose interest in Europe. So that's not going to happen at all, because that's also, again, to counter China, because it's showing it's in decline, in economic decline right now. It's like kind of slow decline. China is looking to increase its partnerships, for example, in BRICS. So to counter that, United States will not abandon Europe. Even, tariffs will be imposed on Chinese goods. And economically, United States, it's in the United States' interest not to lose Europe regardless of the whatever the specific kind of things will be done in economy. So no, I say Europe is not going anywhere economically for the United States. It's going to remain in the United States' interests.
Yeah, my apologies, Nigel. I didn't let you give you an opportunity to answer the previous question. So you now have 2 questions.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, just very quickly on the first one about Trump interest rather than values. So I don't think this is an advantage in any way. It's a narrower bandwidth of the transatlantic relationship. In the past, for the most part, it was common interests reinforced by common values, something like that. And the values part was certainly not trivial. And here, again, Europe is faced with a situation where the glue of values and institutions, for the most part, won't be there. And it's a relationship that will be defined more, as it were, narrowly and nakedly than before by alignments of interest, so narrowly conceived. So that's the real challenge. There are arguments that Europe can offer to the Trump administration to make that case. Tatsiana has touched on the trading relationship, and yes, Europe should in effect be saying, you can't want to sell us more goods and also abandon us at the same time, because the Europe that is imperiled by a threatening Russia, and possibly also a Europe in turmoil by, in the worst case, the consequences of a defeat for Ukraine, which would send at least, by some estimates, 10 million, maybe 20 million Ukrainians surging across the western border. That's not going to be a Europe that was well equipped to become or to maintain its status as a vibrant economic partner. And incidentally, it's not only about trade. Trump talks about trade, but he also talks unhappily about trade surpluses. And he wants to sell more, not import more. What's no less important is Europe as an investment partner. And Europe, together with Japan, dwarfs the rest of the world, and certainly dwarfs China, as a source of foreign direct investment into the United States. And that's a source of American jobs. So that case should be made as well. A second consideration is energy. Now, Europe still buys plenty of Russian liquefied natural gas, LNG. They should be buying American LNG instead. They are buying some, but they should buy more. That's a natural alignment, and that would hurt Russia. Oil too. Now, there's a formal European oil embargo on Russia, on Russian imports. But in fact, European imports of Russian oil have been increasing because they are receiving that oil once it's been through India and be refined in India. So Europe's imports of Russian oil products are rising. And that's a problem. And America Trump has nominated an energy secretary who wants to just drill more, played an important role in the shale oil revolution in the United States, which has transformed America as a major exporter. So there's alignment there as well. And finally, in terms of self-interest and alignments, you might say, well, Trump might not want to give weapons to Europe anymore, but he can sell them. And if we together can get the over $320 billion of Russian central bank assets frozen in G7 jurisdictions, most of them in Europe, incidentally, $320 billion is a lot of money. A proportion of that could be set aside to buy weapons for Europe and for Ukraine from the United States. Again, American jobs. So those are the sorts of arguments I think would be helpful. What can Europe do? I think that's the in the worst case, if I understood your second question right, in the worst case, if Europe can't persuade the United States to remain sort of committed to protecting Europe, what can Europe do on its own? Well, it can do more than it thinks. The question is whether it has the political unity and will to do so. And So if you look at the raw GDPs, the raw kind of economic capability of Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other, Europe exceeds Russia by many times, by around, even if you do the calculation by purchasing power parity, which is the way that's most favorable to Russia, then you're looking at a European collective economy, which is around, I think, roughly 6 or 7 times larger than Russia, and more by other ways of calculating it. So, raw economic strength that could be turned into military power greatly favors the balance of resources, favors Europe. The worry is that the balance of will, the balance of resolve, favors Russia. And to put into perspective how much Europe has already provided to Ukraine, now it's in terms of military aid, it's around $50 billion. Now, that might sound a lot, but if you divide that by the population of Europe, which is roughly 500 million, that works out as about $100 per person that Europe has provided. If you divide that by the 33 months that the war has been going on, that's $3 per person per month, which is equivalent to an indifferent cup of coffee per person per month. So actually, the potential is there to do a great deal more. The thing that Europe really needs to do is to start properly investing in its defense industrial capacity, the factories that make the stuff. So it's not enough to give a diminishing trickle of donations. You've got to build up, invest in the capital stock that enables you to produce this stuff indefinitely. And Europe has still been far too slow in that. Petr Lunak in his opening remarks said that Europe is doing this now. I really don't see it, unfortunately, and we need the leadership in Europe to do that very, very quickly.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. And Franak, so the question was to you about the diaspora in context of political prisoners. There's also an additional question which is about prisoner exchanges. Question is, can we expect the US and Western states more generally to engage in more prisoner exchanges? To release political prisoners in exchange for criminals arrested in the West. So if I understand that question, it's sort of linking the idea of political prisoners and other kinds of exchanges. Between the US and its allies and adversaries.
Of course, we can only speculate right now, but I think any release of political prisoners would be the victory, either for Trump or any other president. Of course, if they will secure, the release of people through the exchange or through the pressure, that can be credited, to new administration, they would go into that. I don't, because we saw right now, that basically this Russian-American, German, and other countries exchange which happened, it got, it brought some extra political points to leaders, and I think this will be used by anyone. Speaking about Trump, what he can do on releasing political prisoners, he can use stronger language, and he can put the question of release of political prisoners as the sort of ultimatum. And this is something that was done during George Bush in 2006 and 2007. It was said to Lukashenko that if you don't release, there were 7 political leaders behind bars. If you don't release them in months, there will be harsh sanctions on the oil sector. And during the next few weeks, we saw people released from jails, including leaders of the protest 2006. So I think this could be the instrument, that could be the tool, the language of ultimatum towards Lukashenko. And from our knowledge for Lukashenko, this is the language he understands, because he doesn't understand the language of this soft diplomacy. But how to put, this question on the agenda of President Trump, that could be the problem. Because in 2020, let me get back to the previous term of Trump again. Remember, the electoral campaign was happening on the background of Belarusian protests. And the Trump And it was actually part of the debate between Trump and Biden. And Biden was criticizing during that campaign, he was criticizing Trump for not speaking about Belarus. So in September, Trump answered finally after months or two, months and a half of protests. And he said that, oh yeah, these protests are peaceful. We must take a look at that, and I will talk to Russia. But we should not blame Trump, because talking with Russia about Belarusian protests, it was not only the Trump's desire, it was also President Macron. It was first visit to Vilnius when he met Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, and he proposed Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya to talk to Putin about Belarus. It was this prism when the whole West was looking at Belarus through Russian lenses. I think right now it changed, and I don't think many leaders have the same perception that they should think about and speak about Belarus only with Putin. Politicians realize that they can do something about Belarus directly without Putin's mediation. So we will see if President Trump will be trying to will be putting Belarus on the agenda only as the Russian topic, to discuss. Later, in December, actually, 2020, already after Trump was already lost. Actually, he lost, but he was not yet inaugurated. He signed all the anti-Lukashenko documents. He signed sanctions. He signed Belarus Democracy Act. He gave permission to appoint Julie Fisher as ambassador, which was super important. So in the last months, already after elections, he made quite strong steps on Belarus without any mediation of Putin.
Those are good points. Okay, so before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask if any of the speakers want to respond to anything that they've heard from the others, or say any last word. If any of you wish to say anything? Okay, I guess not. Okay, in that case, I think this has been it's been quite a rich discussion. There definitely have been some cause for optimism as well as some cause for pessimism. Of course, we don't know what will happen come next year. That's something that we're all aware of. People like to say that Trump is unpredictable, but actually, just listening to what people say, picking up Tatsiana's point that Trump is like the US, all presidents try to shape the US presidency, picking up on points about how presidency constrains the person holding the office as well. It means that we do have some scope for shaping expectations about what will happen in respect of both Ukraine and Belarus. There are many futures, and I'm sure that whatever Mr. Trump thinks today, what any of us think today, we can expect some unexpected developments as the next US presidency unfolds. So this webinar will be distilled into a policy brief document, which I will be writing in the next couple of weeks, which will be put online on our website. So please do, to the audience, please do have a look at our website. The Warwick Ukraine-Belarus Hub website is warwick.ac.uk/WUB Hub, and there are previous policy briefs on there, and recordings of previous webinars. Before I thank our speakers, just to let the audience know that the WUB Hub is resuming after a hiatus, and so there will be more webinars, more podcasts, more blogs. If you're local to the University of Warwick, more film screenings coming up in the first half of next year. So please do keep an eye on our website. So thank you to everyone who's joined us here today. Thank you for the questions. Thank you especially to our 4 speakers for giving us their time and their analysis. It's wonderful to have you all. I think it's a strong webinar to revive the WUB Hub project with. As mentioned, this was also organised in cooperation with the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. I'm grateful to Victoria, who unfortunately has had to leave already. I'm grateful to her and to the NATO Public Diplomacy Division for their support. Recording of this webinar will be available on our website, possibly as early as this evening, but certainly in the next couple of days. Just thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you all again soon.